So I'd like to continue talking about the research article, the AKDN Ethical Framework, published by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. And in particular, I want to look at traits of Islam's ethical ideal informing the AKDN mandate. And we're going to particularly look at inclusiveness as well as education and research. And again, in this video, I'll talk about these topics. In subsequent videos, I'll talk about other topics in that paper. So to begin with, Islam has a ethic of inclusiveness. It really takes on an inclusive vision of society. And I think sometimes people mistakenly think that Islam is a very narrow faith, and they may base their assessment on the actions of a misguided, but let's say highly vociferous minority. But if you look at the actual Quran itself, you'll find that it actually supports notions like pluralism and inclusiveness. And in particular, the Quran says in Surah 48, Ayat 13, it says, "People, we created you all from a single man and a single woman and made you into races and tribes so that you should recognize one another. In God's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones who are most mindful of Him," or who are the ones, rather, in God's eyes, the most honored of you are the ones most mindful of Him. And I think the key phrase here is that um, we made you into races and tribes so you can recognize and get to know one another. So in many ways, the the Quran not only recognizes and embraces diversity, it does so as part of the divine plan, if you will. Now, the Prophet Muhammad, tried to foster that spirit of harmony and toleration during his time. So now let me kind of move on and talk a bit more about education and research in the context of the Quran and in the context of Islam. Now, Islam is, as a religion, has really embraced the idea of the enlightened mind. And in fact, if you even look at the very first revelation to the Prophet, that revelation contained within it, the first word was a command to read. Okay? And overall, just throughout the Quran, there are many references to intellectual development, and the Quran actually says that those who believe and have knowledge are considered exalted. Okay? And in fact, there is a specific surah in the Quran, Surah 20, Ayat 114. It says, "Prophet, do not rush to recite before the revelation is fully complete, but say, 'My Lord, increase me in knowledge.'" And here you can think of "increase me in knowledge" as a prayer that the Prophet was urged to say. And again, even beyond just the Quran, even in the traditions of the Prophet in the Hadith, this same notion is continued. So, for example, according to the Hadith, which, as I mentioned, comprises the sayings and actions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that learning ennobles whatever its source, even if that be in distant China, and that it's obligatory upon every Muslim man and woman. Okay, now Hazrat Ali, who was the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet, continued this tradition. Actually, Hazrat Ali was also the first Shia Imam, and he said that, quote, "One's greatest ornament is erudition," and, quote, "the most self-sustaining wealth is the intellect," unquote, which, quote, "gives mastery over one's own destiny," unquote. So I think, again, it's a very powerful sentiment from the first Imam. All right, now Nasr Khusra, who is depicted here, a famous poet and philosopher and Islamic scholar, and I think he was alive circa the 11th century, and he was predominantly based out of Iran. He actually said that, quote, "Knowledge is a shield against the blows of time." All right? But I think he also went on to say, and other poets and philosophers and religious scholars said that the person of knowledge and wisdom really has an obligation to share that knowledge and wisdom. And in fact, the Prophet had compared unshared knowledge to a girdle of fire around a person's neck. All right? Just to kind of further talk more about the hadiths and the traditions and some of the sayings of the leaders of the faith, Hazrat Ali also said that, quote, "One dies not who gives life to learning." All right, so this ethics of education and research actually was certainly promoted by the Prophet, by Hazrat Ali and others, but it was also carried on by many of the early Muslim scholars. So in fact, in Fatimid Ismaili Cairo, institutions like Al-Azhar University, and also um, the Dar al-Ilm, which were major institutions for learning, were established, and these were established actually in Fatimid Cairo, Okay, and actually there were counterparts for these institutions in other places. So, for example, there were counterparts in Baghdad, in Cordova, in Bukhara, in Samarkand, and in other Muslim centers. All right. Now, in the 9th century, Al-Kindi, who's depicted here, another very famous scholar of Islam, and you can see him. He's holding a book in this particular picture. He was a 9th century philosopher, so he actually predates Nasr Khusra. He wrote that, quote, truth never abases, it only elevates its seeker. Okay? And in fact, Al-Kindi was a student of Greek philosophy. He actually had no qualms about acquiring knowledge that came from other sources. In many ways, he was agnostic to the source. He really didn't care. He was indifferent to the source of that knowledge. All right, and the result is at that time, if you kind of look at Islam during this time, there were numerous scientific advancements, and these scientific advancements spanned multiple fields like mathematics, astronomy, botany, medicine, optics, pharmacology, zoology, geography, and so on and so forth. And in fact, George Sarton, who wrote a book called The History of Science, he noted that from the year 750 onwards, there were 6 consecutive centuries of Muslim preeminence within scientific endeavors. 6 consecutive centuries. And so as you can imagine, just scientific advancement, the acquisition of knowledge was important. But what was also important, it was the spirit of inquiry. All right? And the Quran actually promoted the idea that one has to ponder creation to understand God's greatness. You have to actually ponder creation. You can't necessarily just take things at face value. You have to think about things, even though it's good to have an open mind, and that was encouraged, but you still have to inquire. And in fact, Ar-Razi, who is depicted right here, Ar-Razi, and I think Ar-Razi died in 925, to give you an idea of when he was around. He was a philosopher and a medical scientist, and he actually wrote with reference to someone named Galen that, quote, but all this reverence will not and should not prevent me from doubting what is erroneous in his theories, unquote. And so in other words, he was basically saying he would try to learn from him where he could, but he wouldn't keep himself from doubting things that didn't make sense to him. So he would question what he thought were the mistakes in the prior lines of work. All right, and just another example as well, if you look at the field of modern optics, actually a lot of the foundations for modern optics were laid out by Muslim scientists like Ibn Haytham and Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, and Ibn Sina is also known as Avicenna in the West. And what they actually did, they actually challenged the Euclidean and Ptolemaic view that the eye was sending out visual rays to the object of vision, and that clearly was not the right way to think about optics. But by challenging those initial notions and then building upon their own investigations and understandings, they were able to make significant advances in optics. And so overall, research was really considered a vehicle for intellectual growth, and it was consistent with the Islamic spirit, since it was deemed that the human intellect was a divine gift, and that as such, it had to be cherished and cultivated. So I want to maybe give a couple of more hadith examples and quotes of Hazrat Ali as well. So in one of the hadiths, the Prophet says that accept whatever adds to your wisdom, regardless of the nature of its source. And then Hazrat Ali says that, quote, wisdom sustains the intellect, unquote, whose, quote, natural disposition is to learn from experience. Wisdom sustains the intellect, whose natural disposition is to learn from experience. Very profound quote by Hazrat Ali. And I want to close with one more quote from the AKDN paper. And it says, quote, jurists and mystics from the classical Middle Ages to the 20th century, from Al-Ghazali, Ibn Khalikan and Sanai, to Sheikh Shalut and Muhammad Iqbal, have upheld and celebrated the never-ending duty of the mind to push the frontiers of its gaze to ever-expanding horizons, to capture glimpses of a flawless, continuing creation.